Hi, I'm here to talk about virtualization and capacity management. Virtualization has been with us in the IT industry for approximately 10 years now, certainly in the distributed environment, and many years ago was introduced back in the mainframe environment. So what is virtualization? Virtualization allows for multiple guest operating systems to be shared on an underlying physical system through use of a hypervisor. But capacity management is very important in the virtualization space for a number of reasons. The first reason is that we are sharing infrastructure. So we're sharing the actual CPU, the memory, the storage, and we have to be aware of the usage of our guest operating systems in terms of those usage of those components. Secondly, we're dealing with clustered environments, so where we're pooling lots of hosts together and how they're performing with each other, especially when you can migrate virtual machines from one physical host to another. You have tools that are available within your virtualized environments that can balance those clusters out in terms of workload. However, we still need to be aware of the bathtub effect, of how that's filling up and at what point we need to make changes. In other words, at what point do we need to buy a bigger bathtub? We need to be very aware of the performance of our virtual machines and the underlying infrastructure. For example, whether virtual machines have any limits applied to them, or whether they're part of a resource pool that has any limits applied. What shares are applied to those virtual machines and how they affect performance. Shares will come into play when there's contention for resources. And whether you've guaranteed any resources, for example, applied any reservations. Because if we apply limits, for example, to a virtual machine or a resource pool, and you see 100% of CPU usage for that virtual machine, what is that 100% of? So we need to be aware in terms of capacity management for reporting and for forecasting in terms of what our underlying resources have, what they've been applied to. Another important point about capacity management and virtualization is to deal with VM sprawl. So what's VM sprawl? Well, it's very easy within a virtualization environment to create virtual machines very quickly. So what you can end up having is lots of virtual machines that no one really understands what they've been created for and taking up resources. Now, what is the resources that have been applied to those virtual machines? Well, with Athene in particular, you can automatically identify idle virtual machines, oversized virtual machines, and undersized virtual machines. So we can control that VM sprawl. Also, what's very important in terms of a virtualization environment is the physical to virtual migrations. When we have all of our physical systems, our traditional physical systems, that we can now identify to be candidates for physical to virtual migration, is that we don't necessarily have to give the same resources that it had as a physical system into our virtual system. So we can perform some kind of right sizing. So we can do that by monitoring our physical systems and then converting them to virtual systems. So we have increasing workloads as more and more virtual machines go onto our virtualized environments. Remember that we're dealing with physical hosts here that are hosting hypervisors for your virtual environment. So what about forecasting? Increasing the amount of workloads that are coming in. How do we categorize workloads? What do we class as those workloads, and how can we roll them forward so that we can model what's going to happen to our environment, so that we can then decide to purchase more systems if necessary. But what also we're interested in is getting the right optimization for the numbers of virtual machines to the numbers of hosts we have, our VM to host ratio. So we have performance and capacity planning. So performance, we're dealing with what's happening now, how the systems are performing. And then planning, we're dealing with what's going to happen in the future and trying to predict that and be able to make proactive decisions. So what we want to do is be able to understand where we can make savings for the business, where we can identify capital expenditure savings and operational expenditure savings. So Athene can help identifying the right metrics at the right level. It can control VM sprawl, automatic identification of idle, oversized and undersized virtual machines. It can assist in the right size for your hardware upgrades. So when we're doing a hardware upgrade, if we need to put more systems into our virtualized environment, what are the right systems that we need? Not just the biggest systems, which are ultimately the more expensive systems. So we can also provide the performance and the capacity assurance that the business needs.